I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang, Forbes.com, is in Toronto, and we're off to Idaho to be joined by our colleague and friend, Stephen Yates, who's in Bonneville County. This is Idaho, in the state of Idaho, Idaho Falls. He is a candidate for the House of Representatives in Idaho, District 30. That's the House of Representatives in the state legislature in Idaho. But I go instead to a quote in these last hours from John Kerry. I want to begin this because Stephen served in the Bush administration. He worked for the vice president, so he's very familiar with remarks by state leaders about how difficult the world is, the conflicts in the world. During the Cold War, said Mr. Kerry in these last hours, it was easier than it is today. Simpler is maybe a way to put it. The choices were less varied, less complicated, more stark, more clear. Communism, democracy, West, East, the Iron Curtain. Mr. Kerry went on to say, multiple emerging powers like radical Islam and too many failed states have changed the landscape. He then commented, in the 50s and 60s, we, the United States, could make really bad decisions and still win because we were pretty much the sole dominant economic and military power around. It's not true anymore. Stephen, a very good evening to you. I'm smiling. The Secretary of State says, gee, foreign policy is tough. Let's not talk of the Ukraine. That might be too tough. But foreign policy in Asia, the president's embassy to Asia, to reassure allies is one interpretation. Tokyo, Seoul, Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and Manila. Is foreign policy tougher now than in the old days when you were in the White House? Good evening to you, Stephen.
Good evening, John. I feel somewhat sorry for the Secretary that the world of foreign policy, when you are an executive in a leadership position, is different from being a critic from Capitol Hill in the United States Senate for several decades on the Foreign Relations Committee. And even though things may have seemed simpler in the Cold War, Secretary Kerry seemed to have found a way to be wrong on some of those issues as well. But bygones. I do believe that the issues we face today are difficult. I can't say that they're more difficult. North Korea nuclear challenge has been with us for a long time. China's rise has been something that we have been grappling with for multiple decades at this point. And the economic interdependence that we have with the broader Asian region is a reality that has been with us for some time. And so with the president going to Asia, he does need to reassure allies. We'll see how much they are, in fact, enthusiastic about the promises he may make, given the seeming atrophy of alliance commitments in other parts of the world, and the fate of the trade agreement that is his cornerstone of his Asia policy, the TransPacific Partnership. He's seeking further commitments there, but unsure how much he can deliver here at home in terms of our U.S. Congress supporting, especially his Democratic caucus in an election year.
Gordon?
Steve, I think this is a question of attitude. If we go back to the 1970s, there was the Nixons and the Kissingers talking about, the United States is in so much trouble. We need this or we need that, and the world's very complicated. And then guess what? Ronald Reagan came in and saw the world in clear terms. He was willing to use American power, and he was able to accomplish much. Now, this seems to me that Kerry is suffering under the same problems that Nixon and Kissinger were labored under, essentially that Kerry does not see the world in clear terms. He's not willing to use American power, and so therefore things are complicated. Do you agree or disagree?
I think there's a great deal of truth to that. We do have a particular pattern of behavior on display of talking up the problems of the world and talking down America's ability to grapple with them in a way that's not terribly consistent with our tradition of believing that we can accomplish almost anything. You can debate whether that's rational or irrational, but we've done a few crazy things like go all the way to the moon and back under that kind of thinking. It is definitely true that if we focus on an objective and a leader of our nation rallies the country to a cause, we're capable of great things, including great change in the world. And we have a leadership right now that doesn't seem to be even trying.
Focusing entirely on Japan right now, the president, in speaking with Mr. Abe, looking to reassure Japan that we are allied and that a threat to Japan is a threat to the United States. Do the Japanese believe it, Stephen? Your opinion?
My opinion is they welcomed the statement. It was a careful and hedged one. It was a good one. And I don't think that the Japanese are going to say all is well and we don't need to continue our own preparations for a more independent foreign policy. There's, I think, no development in East Asia that would suggest the United States is going to carry a full burden of problem solving or resolving issues with China. So I think that they basically say thank you and politely help the president along to his next stop.
Gordon?
Steve, it seems to me that the problem with American foreign policy with regard to China in particular is that, we're trying to tack. Sometimes we try to reassure our allies. Other times we try to integrate the Chinese into the international system. We end up doing neither. And I think that's really a problem. We have a foreign policy which we cannot articulate, and therefore we cannot implement it. It seems to me that at some point we just need to say, we're going to defend our allies, and that's it. And I think that would really bring us closer, much closer to peace in the region.
Well, I agree that we need to be much, much more clear in that regard. I don't oppose an attempt at balancing these kinds of interests and approaches. The problem is that we do have a revisionist power that is quite large in this mix that is not interested in balance. It is seeking to make things unbalanced in the region. And so we have a wishful approach to foreign policy as opposed to a realistic and results-oriented approach. In that context, I think it's far safer and more advisable to move in the direction you suggest.
Stephen, we've been puzzling with a number of our correspondents tonight about the aggression shown by the PLA. As recently as several days ago, 10 days ago or more, when the Secretary of Defense was touring China, the defense chief made remarks, don't do a NATO with us, don't surround us with your allies, don't try to hem us in. Very threatening remarks. We know that in East China Sea and South China Sea there have been more than threats. There have been moves by the PLA Navy. Your opinion, Stephen, is this profoundly different than the PLA that you dealt with in 2001, that incident of the banging between aircraft that brought down one of our surveillance aircraft? Is this a different PLA today, or is it the same?
Well, there are some similar qualities. I remember at the time that when we would have national leaders go to China, very often China would conspicuously have a long-range missile test or allow for a satellite photo of some new advanced aircraft model, things like that would send conflicting signals to us and to their people at those times. We would always avoid doing things like that. And, of course, there was the EP-3 incident where we were close in on their territorial limits, and they were seeking to push us back. The difference today is that their reach is farther, their capabilities are stronger, and that our allies don't believe as firmly that we will be there. As much as people wanted to criticize President Bush for what they perceived as cowboy diplomacy, in a way, it did actually help reassure our allies that if called upon, we would actually take action. But we've had, whether it's across the Arab Spring and the broader Middle East, the negotiations with Iran, and now in Europe, is the reverse signal. And I think that's seeping into Asia, that doubt. And that means that China will push more.
Gordon?
We had the dismal Carter years, and they were followed by Reagan. Do you think we're going to have a reassessment in both political parties about the Obama foreign policy, and that we'll have a more resolute posture, whoever is elected in 2016? Or how do you see this going forward?
Well, I would love to believe that would be in the offing. That sort of aligns with my partisan wishes as well as what I think are the strategic needs for the country and the world, for that matter. I don't, at the moment, see very clearly who the Reagan figure is in our ranks. But I think there was a critical pivot during the Carter years that really moved the country in a different direction and allowed a Reagan to emerge and have that kind of effect on foreign policy, and that was the 444 days of the hostage crisis in Iran. It made it very, very clear that weakness was provocative and that we needed to have a dramatically different approach to the world. And I think that was an opening. I don't want the United States to go through something similar, but many times it does take a major catalytic event for perceptions to change. Right now, we still seem to be in a hangover about perceptions of a decade of war.
The president's embassy in Asia is coming right upon the Ukraine crisis. Do you think that the Obama administration is looking for this trip to make it clear to China not to make a move on the East China Sea? We even had a suggestion tonight from a professor at the Naval War College that the Ryukyu Islands, which is occupied, 1.5 million people in the Japanese chain, could be in the target hairs of China. Do you think the president is conveying that message now because of Ukraine?
Well, I think the president's conveying that message now, possibly with higher profile because of the situation in the Ukraine. We've, of course, had the Vice President of the United States in the Ukraine making a pretty declarative and categorical statement about sovereign boundaries that have already been violated. So it's difficult to see how much of an impact this has. Obviously, our statements of support and protection of the boundaries hasn't deterred Vladimir Putin. Hard to believe that I think a bloody-minded and very calculating leadership in China is going to be very moved by presidential statements without action and capability to back it up.
Stephen Yates, former member of the Bush administration. He worked in the vice president's office. He's the chief executive officer of D.C. International Advisory. Most importantly, is now candidate for the Republican nomination to run for the representatives, the House of Representatives in the legislature of Idaho, the state of Idaho. For those listening in Asia, this is a very proud state, part of the West where glory is. Bonneville County, Idaho Falls, is the wonderful town. I've seen pictures, and someday I hope that Stephen buys me an ice cream cone on the front stoop of the parlor there. I'm John Batchelor with Gordon Chang.